Chapter 1291, The End. To the civilians in the palace, although the Wei Wu army had previously stormed the palace with their horses, nothing out of the ordinary had happened. They went around the palace and left the city. Although the massacre at the Limestone Road sounded very ferocious, it was treated as an accident. For example, if a new aristocrat was occasionally arrogant, people would still be able to accept this. It was only puzzling that no one had punished them. But this time, it was different. The Wei Wu army had said that all those who dared to leave the palace would die. This meant that they were against the entire palace. It was not an uprising of a new aristocrat. They were about to overturn the order of the palace. Were they going to move into the palace? When the imperial edict was issued by the palace of the King of Gods, civilians who talked about this in private all felt that the Wei Wu army was done for. But shortly after, news that the elites from the palace had been murdered reached their ears. They loved to talk about politics after a meal. No one could stop the passion of the civilians towards politics. At this moment, they felt that something was wrong. Everyone felt that the Wei Wu army was unstoppable. Then, the news that there was a new West Lord of Heaven came. No one expected that the Lord of Heaven, who had existed for thousands of years, would collapse. What about the new king? Since the palace of the King of Gods had issued an imperial edict, why was the Wei Wu army still active? Until now, no one felt that the Wei Wu army would do anything else out of the ordinary. They felt that the Wei Wu army should guard the West region. But now, they heard that the Wei Wu army was heading towards the palace. These waves of shocking news left everyone helpless. The Wei Wu army was far too ferocious. It was as if they were about to topple the system of the imperial court that they were used to for thousands of years. Now, the imperial dragon soldiers had suddenly appeared in the palace. Furthermore, they attacked and formed rivers of blood. Cold and cruel breaths were emitted from their helmets. This was a chilling sight. No one dared to move. No one dared to escape the palace. All they could do was to try and not attract the attention of these demons. Li Haitan felt that this was slightly boring. He had thought that this massacre in the palace would be shocking. He did not expect it to end after a short attack. He wanted to continue. He looked at the streets. He wanted to kill a few more people and show off his aura. But Li Liang said through the communication channel, "Don't kill the innocent." Li Liang had seen many people like Li Haitan. There were times where the massacre of inhabitants in a city was not because of a command, but because the demons in their hearts had been released. After people's hearts were engulfed by demons, they became beasts and animals. They destroyed and played with all the lives they could see. Li Liang respected Lu Shu for the fact that he remained clear-headed when he attacked the West region. Furthermore, he was able to make Li Haitan and the others promise to maintain their true selves. Back then, the old King of Gods had indulged in killing the inhabitants of cities. But now, Lu Shu had moral values. He never gave in or indulged in temptations. Li Liang felt that this was very good. Following an owner who was kind was much better than following a cold and emotionless one. At least he did not need to worry that he would fall into an abyss just with one small mistake. This time, the imperial dragon soldiers did not hurry through the palace. Their armor crashed against one another. No one dared to look directly at them. Over the past few hundred years, prioritizing a proper education over a physical education had been trending. Males easily struck favor with the girls in the palace by dressing up in a delicate style. Some males even put on their own makeup, becoming even more beautiful than females. Some girls would even throw their handkerchiefs at these males when they walked along the streets of the palace. This was to display their love. But when the imperial dragon soldiers traveled, the beautiful males hid at the sides of the road. They silently lowered their heads. They did not even dare to breathe. Li Haitan and the others did not take off their helmets. The patterns on the helmets made them seem even more frightening and ferocious. When the girls saw this, they suddenly felt that there was something wrong with their minds back then. They actually fell for such males who were not manly at all. There was nothing wrong with pretty boys, but the appreciation of beauty in the palace was excessive. Being pretty was not enough. They had to be gorgeous. When these males were compared to Lee Heighton and the rest, some girls even felt a desire to be conquered. So these were men. Of course, these were the thoughts of only a small proportion of the girls in the palace. Furthermore, Lee Heighton and the rest could not represent all the males in the world. But the street of killing, the smell of blood, and the cold but cruel helmets caused everyone to form a strange sense of admiration. No wonder the Wei Wu army was so ferocious. They were the fabled Wei Wu army. Back then, when the Wei Wu army charged into the palace on their horses, most people did not witness it for themselves. After all, no one dared to approach the limestone road. Those who had witnessed the Wei Wu army were very shocked, especially since the palace had prioritized proper education over physical education. But Lee Heighton and the others did not care about these people. Instead, they headed to the Peach Blossom Association. Not long after, the masters in the Peach Blossom Association heard heavy footsteps. They knew that the Wei Wu army was coming for them. Their slaves came and reported that the Wei Wu army was getting closer and closer to the Peach Blossom Association. But when they heard the sound of the armor and their footsteps, they panicked. What should they do? How should they deal with this group of murderers? But after thinking about it, they understood that they were helpless. As they waited for the Wei Wu army to arrive, they understood how amusing their calculations were. They would not rest until they met their objectives. Many people in this world had a mysterious trust in luck. Lee Heighton and the rest surrounded the Peach Blossom Association. All those who dared to approach them would die. Li Liang led the Imperial Dragon soldiers and entered the Peach Blossom Association. None of the king's studies scholars and the aristocrats dared to speak. As they thought about how they should escape, Li Liang suddenly saluted someone behind them. "Great Lord, the palace has been sealed." The masters looked back in shock. They saw Lu Shu, who had returned to his original appearance, happily looking at them. Li Liang said that the palace had been sealed. They did not leave any troops to guard the city, but he spoke clearly and confidently. He was very sure that no one would risk their lives against them. Lu Shu laughed at the masters. "Didn't you ask what I was doing just now? Come, come. Everyone who comes here will receive a book. I will speak to everyone later. Not all my people are here yet." The masters were all dumbfounded. Not all my people are here yet? Where was the rest of the Wei Wu army? They suddenly had a very unpleasant premonition. It was the end for them. Chapter 1292, What are you planning? Everyone in the Peach Blossom Association was quiet with fear. No one had expected Lu Shu to already be here. The manager with a sharp voice was about to collapse. How would he have known that the person he shouted at was the person the palace was most afraid of? He did not dare to speak. His cold sweat wet his clothes in 2 seconds. His legs were starting to give way. How many people had the Wei Wu army killed? At least he was still alive. All the wealthy families in the palace gathered together because of this person. He had even scolded him for giving out things. Who would have thought that a major figure like you would come all the way to this broken place to give out books? To be honest, Lu Shu could only heave a sigh of relief now. This time, reality proved that his plans would never work. Such a perfect condition had been disturbed by the sudden appearance of the wealthy families from the palace. Earlier on, Lu Shu was most worried that his plan to earn distress points would not work. These distress points were very important. They determined whether Lu Shu would successfully be able to light up the 6th star. But just as Lu Shu's plans were destroyed, the Imperial Dragon soldiers had finally made their way here. His plan was complete. Everything that happened from now was not in Lu Shu's plans. He had to play by the ear. Whoever allowed him to make plans, he would break their legs. Why are you dumbfounded? Lu Shu looked at the masters of the wealthy families, who were immobilized. Come here and take your learning materials. At this moment, Lu Shu suddenly felt as if he was a teacher back at the Luotian Cultivation College. All the people in front of him were his students. The masters looked at one another helplessly. They had no choice but to endure this. The situation was overwhelming. It seemed like they would be killed if they did not cooperate. The masters lined up in front of Lu Shu and took a book each. The old men, who needed servants to serve them cigarettes, were quickly humbled. Who dared to put on airs during times like this? They would rather wait for their deaths. Not only did the masters have to take the books, their slaves had to as well. Everyone had to take a book. Lu Shu turned back and looked at the 3 old King's Studies scholars. Why are you still sitting there? Come and take your books. The King's Studies scholars were all obedient. They had wanted to work together with the scholars to condemn Lu Shu in speech and writing. Now, they did not dare to say anything. Scholars often condemned others behind their backs. Not many people dared to speak directly to their faces. With these 3 King's Studies scholars taking the lead, the other King's Studies scholars who had not received the books also came and lined up. Li Haitan saw this from the side. It was as if he was watching himself take learning materials during his cultural classes. The King's Studies scholars were in despair. What could they do? Although they dared to argue with the wealthy families from the palace, it was because they knew that everyone was still acting within the rules. Even if there was conflict, it would not affect their lives. But now, it was different. If they did not obey, they would die. Furthermore, all they had to do was to take books. There was nothing wrong with looking through the books. No matter whether it was the wealthy families in the palace, or the remaining King's Studies scholars, they were dumbfounded when they saw the contents of the book. Had Lu Shu painstakingly given out these books just to subvert the reality that the old King of Gods had written these poems? The King's Studies scholars and the masters of the wealthy families looked at Li Haitan and the others, who were staring at them ferociously and had a murderous aura around them. They were about to go crazy. What were you planning? They could not understand why Lu Shu wanted to involve so many of them. Would subverting the culture of the old King of Gods affect the authority of this world in any way? Of course, they did not know that Lu Shu wanted to use this to advance. Thus, in their eyes, they felt that Lu Shu had gone crazy, but they did not dare to say anything. At that moment, everyone in the palace was silent. The vendors quickly packed up and left. The owners of shops hurriedly pulled in their staff and closed their doors. The prosperous city suddenly turned bleak in a flash. Only the leaves that had fallen by the roadside were being pushed around by the wind. Someone secretly looked out of the door through a small gap. Someone else was shocked and pulled him away. He said in a low tone, "Are you crazy? Don't you know that rank 1 experts can feel the gaze of others?" This was not a secret. This was also the reason why many civilians did not dare to look directly at experts. The person who had looked out muttered, "The Weiwu army doesn't have many rank 1 experts, right? Didn't they only have 4 or 5 rank 1 experts? Are you stupid? Do you believe everything people tell you? Would they be able to defeat the West region with only 4 or 5 rank 1 experts?" He was anxious. Can you think about it? Would they dare to launch a massacre in the palace with only 4 or 5 rank 1 experts? They probably have about 40 or 50 of them. He was a wise person. He deduced the process through the results. It was much more reliable than relying on information from outsiders. Someone softly said, "I heard that when the Weiwu army attacks cities, over 10 soldiers wearing black armor will crash into the city wall. Even mountains looked as if they were about to collapse. I suspect that they are rank 1 experts." Although the imperial palace soldiers did not display their full power while attacking cities later on, Lu Shu did not kill the inhabitants of the city. The rumors would definitely spread. Some people had already guessed that the Wei Wu army had over 10 rank 1 experts. The person who claimed that the Wei Wu army only had 4 or 5 rank 1 experts had outdated information. His impression of the Wei Wu army was still stuck during the period in the gambling dens. But at that moment, there was the sudden sound of horses being whipped in the streets of the palace. When the horses ran on the limestone road, there was the sound of the road breaking. The massive limestone bricks were broken by the horses. This destruction caused everyone listening to the commotion outside to hold their breath. They suddenly realized that the group of soldiers from the Wei Wu army who had just arrived was probably the most frightening. The person who had been peeking outside could not help but look through the gap in the door through the corner of his eye. He lowered his tone and said, "Black armor and blazing cloud foals. It's them." But just as he finished speaking, there was the sharp sound of a weapon being swung. Crash. The door of the store was destroyed. The people inside were full of fear. Zhang Weiyu stopped his horse. His cold voice could be heard from inside the armor that shook mountains. "How many of you are spying on us?" When the voice resonated with the helmet, it sounded like a whistle from hell. The people inside hurriedly knelt down in fright. "We are simply ordinary businessmen." Zhang Weiyu observed them carefully. Then, they advanced with their horses. "I will have mercy on you." Chapter 1293, Surrender of the Wealthy Families. When the sound of the horses faded away, a terrible scene was left behind on the once neat limestone bricks. Actually, Zhang Weiyu was not cruel. Everyone who had interacted with him knew that if Zhang Weiyu wanted to be cruel, Li Liang would not be able to take the position of the commander of the Imperial Dragon soldiers. Li Liang was able to take the position because he was crueler than Zhang Weiyu. Both Li Liang and Zhang Weiyu, as well as Lu Shu, knew that one had to be cruel to control an army. The reason they made Li Liang take over this position was not because they liked cruelty. Instead, they were aware that in this battle, they could only win if they were as cruel as their enemies. If Lu Shu had to make a choice between the lives of the Imperial Dragon soldiers and the lives of others, he would definitely choose the former. Now, the Imperial Dragon soldiers had to scare their opponents cruelly so to make their opponents bow down to them. However, after they heard that the horses had left, they looked up and suddenly realized that the people wearing black armor were riding on blazing cloud foals. Moreover, there was a group of people with their hands tied behind them. Those people had their hands tied and mouths stuffed to prevent them from complaining. The horses did not travel too quickly. They moved at a speed that was just nice enough for these people to catch up to. The Imperial Palace soldiers did not drag the people on the ground like what Duanmu Huangqi did. They were still slightly empathetic and only made them chase from behind. However, Zhang Weiyu thought that their empathy should end here. The wealthy families should have thought about this when they led the soldiers to the West region earlier on. Those who succeed are called kings, and those who fail are called bandits. In this cruel world, those who lost had to suffer the punishments. The wealthy families of the palace tried to have a backup plan by sending the relatives and their documents out of the city. If they really met Lu Shu, they still had a chance to make a comeback. These relatives brought a huge amount of practitioner resources and valuables in their invisible storage equipment. This was how they could make a comeback. However, how could Lu Shu ensure that they had a retreat path? Didn't Lu Shu put everything in to go to the Luniverse to end the conflict? Why should an outsider have a retreat path? However, despite that, he had never thought of killing those people. When Li Liang heard about Lu Shu's decision, he was sighing at the side but did not make any comment. That was because the lives of those people would not affect the outcome. Suddenly, someone recognized the prisoner that was running behind the horses. They are the outstanding youths of the Li family. 3 of them are within the group. One of them caused a 15-mile heavenly vision when he rose to rank 1. There are also those from the Song family, Fong family and Lu family, someone exclaimed. Oh my goodness. Someone guessed that the wealthy families had secretly sent them out. However, they did not expect that the Weiwu army had caught all of them. This will end the lifeline of the wealthy families. A 15-mile heavenly vision. If he doesn't die, he has the potential to rise to a master realm. When Zhang Weiyu, who was sitting on the horse, heard that, he sneered. Li Haitan's heavenly vision was 16 miles. These so-called prodigy of the palace can't even match up to Li Haitan. Old Zhang, how many miles was your heavenly vision? Someone asked out of curiosity. Zhang Weiyu could not answer. The Great Lord is still waiting for us. Let's not talk about this. I remember very clearly that your heavenly vision was only 15 miles. You are not as good as Li Haitan, someone laughed loudly in the communication channel. Scram scram scram, said Zhang Weiyu unhappily. However, although Li Haitan looked honest, he was far more gifted than most people. He lived miserably in the Azure Dragon Village in the past simply because he did not have powers and resources. Sometimes, after the social class divide, it was extremely difficult for the people in the lower class to move up the ranks. That was because the higher class had the resources all to themselves and it was impossible to move up the ranks. The master of the wealthy families in the Peach Blossom Association also heard the sound of the horses. The only people who would dare to ride the horses at this time would be Lu Shu's men. Initially, everyone panicked when Lu Shu said that his men were not all present as they were guilty. Yet now, the thing they were most worried about seemed to have happened. Zhang Weiyu and the rest went into the Peach Blossom Association while riding their horses. The master of the wealthy family became anxious when he saw them. There was no doubt that all the family members they had sent away were there. Ever since Lu Shu left the Imperial Dragon soldiers, Zhang Weiyu and the rest rode on the blazing cloud foals and rushed all over the Luniverse in order to capture all the family members of the wealthy families who had sneakily escaped. Trying to escape from Lu Shu, no way. Lu Shu wanted to cut away all their backup plans and make the wealthy families of the palace learn a simple lesson. Do not participate in this battle because they cannot afford it. After they got off the horses, Zhang Weiyu and the rest pushed the so-called prodigies of the wealthy families to Lu Shu. Lu Shu was sitting on a chair that Li Haitan had brought over and said, trying to send them away sneakily? Do you think you can make a comeback after offending us? Why should you take everything good? In the world, every spot is the sovereign's ground. Where do you think you can escape to? At this moment, Lu Shu was not holding anything back. He had to use the identity of a king as he wanted to face the enemies of the world with this identity. The master of the Song family fell to his knees and pleaded, "Spare me, great lord." As they had lost their backup, if they did not give in, their entire family would probably be destroyed. They did not know why Lu Shu became the lord, and neither did they know what strange things happened, but it was a fact that Lu Shu was in front of them. After the master of the Song family said that, the other masters of the wealthy families had to follow suit. The king's studies scholars saw all the masters kneel in front of Lu Shu and shouted in unison, "Spare me, great lord." Lu Shu said calmly, "Do you know what the consequences would be after today?" The master of the Song family said sincerely, "If we disobey you, we will definitely be killed by the Weiwu army." In the past, the villagers saw the wealthy family's aggressiveness. However, the so-called cruel beast could only bow down to Lu Shu now. Lu Shu suddenly understood that authority was the thing that all men needed. However, this was not what he wanted. What others wanted was what could kill him. After thinking about it, Lu Shu said, "I have to correct something. They are no longer the Weiwu army, they are the Imperial Dragon soldiers." Chapter 1294, Li Haitan, Get Out. The Imperial Dragon Soldiers. Lu Shu spoke clearly and confidently. The masters even felt as if these words rang beside their ears, never to disappear. The Imperial Dragon Soldiers was a special name. Although names like the Blackfeather Army and the Dragonflame Army sounded ferocious, they were simply ordinary armies to everyone else. But when it came to the Imperial Dragon soldiers, it was as if these soldiers dressed in black armor had become Imperial troops. In the past, people did not understand why the Weiwu army was so strong, and why their average strength was so high. These people had risen in a short span of 1 year. This violated the rules of training. How could an ordinary person advance so many levels in a span of 1 year? Those from the Azure Dragon Village were only rank 5 or rank 6. Lu Yizhao's Qingsai army was only rank 4 or rank 5. How did all of them advance to rank 2 and beyond within 1 year? The wealthy families from the palace were kept awake at night by this question. They could not figure out why. But when they heard the name, the Imperial Dragon Soldiers, it was as if they understood everything. So they were the Imperial Dragon Soldiers. It was as if the name Imperial Dragon Soldiers represented the mysterious power for a miraculous transformation. The previous Imperial Dragon Soldiers were even more dazzling. So they were the Imperial Dragon Soldiers. This sentence repeated itself to the masters of the wealthy families. Now, Lu Shu had practically admitted his own identity. Although everyone felt that there was something wrong with the palace of the King of Gods, they were not involved in the highest-leveled battles. Thus, they did not understand the truth. Although this reality was slightly difficult to accept, Lu Shu was now in front of them. Even if they did not believe this, they had to. But unlike Sun Xuanwen, they did not experience joy after finding out the truth. They were terrified. The wealthy families present had all participated in the battle against the Imperial Dragon Soldiers. Although it seemed as if the Imperial Dragon Soldiers would forgive the wealthy families if they stood in their position, the problem was, if the Imperial Dragon Soldiers entered the palace of the King of Gods, the wealthy families would be replaced in the long run. Which of them would tolerate any existence that betrayed their own wealthy family? Even if they did not care, the people around them would be worried. In the past, when Duanmu Huangqi was in the West region, a government official accidentally crashed a carriage as he was not careful. Back then, Duanmu Huangqi was not as violent as he was now. He did not take it to heart either. But his patron killed the official and his entire family. This was power. Power was the most dangerous thing in this world. Thus, the masters in the Peach Blossom Association trembled with fear. They were afraid. Lu Shu was someone who could rival the old King of Gods. This was the obvious truth. But at this moment, the king's studies scholars thought differently from the wealthy families. Since Lu Shu was the subject of the king's studies, why did he give out these books? Furthermore, since Lu Shu was the King of Gods, then the reality of these books. It was frightening to think about it. At this moment, a king's studies scholar suddenly knelt down and shouted, "The King of Gods was able to confess that he plagiarized. He is the embodiment of courage. Which ordinary person would dare to admit their own faults? But King of Gods, not only did you dare to confess, you have even announced your fault to the world. You are a wise leader." Lu Shu looked at him. He was dumbfounded. What in the world? He had underestimated the ability of these scholars to curry favor. They did not even care that their beliefs had been destroyed. They had to suck up to him as much as possible. If they were to announce this to the outside world, the universe would sing praises of him, right? Why did Lu Shu give them books? Was it to admit that he had copied the poems? No. He wanted these king's studies scholars to scold him. Lu Shu's expression darkened. I hate people who curry favor with me. The Peach Blossom Association was silent. Everyone was going to suck up to him, but when Lu Shu said this, they did not know what to do. Amidst this silence, Li Haitan suddenly muttered, "Don't you like it when people praise you?" Lu Shu said. Li Haitan, get out. At this moment, the king's studies scholar's eyes lit up. The great lord had simply made a claim. The strong man beside him was evidently Lu Shu's trusted subordinate. Would his thoughts be fake? Everyone understood this. People from the upper classes sometimes did not mean what they said. If you trusted what they said, you were foolish. After all, Lu Shu could not admit that he liked being praised by others. Who would confess to this? Thus, the king's studies scholars fell to the ground. Great Lord, you are such a wise leader. The king's studies scholars had wanted to condemn Lu Shu, but now, they were on the verge of writing the desire to live on their foreheads. Lu Shu wanted to kill Li Haitan there and then. He felt that Li Haitan was very lucky to have survived until now. Suddenly, Lu Xiaoyu said, "Lock all of them up. Then, pass the books to the civilians." Although the news will spread more slowly without the king's studies scholars, it is better than letting them curry favor. Although Lu Xiaoyu did not understand why Lu Shu was doing this, since Lu Shu wanted to do it, she would help him. After 10 minutes, the top king's studies scholars disappeared. But their disappearance did not seem to have much impact on the universe. The civilians continued to eat and sleep. Lu Shu stood in the Peach Blossom Association and looked at the masters of the wealthy families in front of him. They had been crawling on the ground for the past 10 minutes. They did not even have the confidence to raise their heads. Two of the masters were the same age as Sun Xuanwen's father. Their trembling bodies made it seem as if new masters were required. But they did not kneel. They probably did not even need to change the masters of their families. The families had to be changed. Lu Shu calmly said, "Do you know what happened 23 and 18 years ago?" The master of the Song family bitterly said, "We didn't have the right to participate in that." Lu Shu had casually asked this. Indeed, these people did not have the right to participate. He did not expect to obtain any answers from them either. Lu Shu left. The Imperial Dragon soldiers immediately mobilized. There was the cold clanging sound of their armor. The masters continued to crawl on the ground. They did not dare to move. After the footsteps grew distant, they finally dared to raise their heads. They had the joy of survivors. Are we free now? How could we be free? The master of the Song family laughed bitterly. Why do you think he left us here? Back then, we were cannon fodder. Isn't it the same now? Chapter 1295, Palace of the King of Gods. When Lu Shu touched the heads of the king's studies scholars, they suddenly disappeared. It was as if these king's studies scholars had never appeared in the world. Rationally, it was easy for Lu Shu to make these masters disappear. But Lu Shu did not do so. Why? Everyone knew that a massive war was about to break out in the universe. Who could say for sure how many people would die? All the wealthy families from the palace would become cannon fodder, right? Furthermore, they received the news that after Sun Xuanwen had obtained the West region, he did not rush to bring in the officials in the West region. Instead, he collected all their manpower and rations in the West region. He would advance towards the palace in a few days. This information shocked the other masters. From this, they could see that Sun Xuanwen was determined on sticking with Lu Shu. Even though he had just obtained the West region, he did not enjoy his authority. Instead, he immediately assembled his troops and prepared for war at the palace. It was as if he was tying himself to Lu Shu's chariot. The masters of the wealthy families wanted to hide, but Sun Xuanwen was afraid that he would fall behind. Their attitudes were very different. Needless to say, Sun Xuanwen already had this attitude. Even if the army from the West region was not used, as long as Lu Shu won this war, Sun Xuanwen's position as West Lord of Heaven would be stable. This was the mindset of a person in power. Staying out of the situation meant that they handed over their authority to other people. When the masters of the wealthy families thought about this, they felt that this was the reason why Sun Xuanwen was able to become the West Lord of Heaven. What could they do? They could only be thrown around by the current. They could even imagine that even if they were not willing to participate, when the army from the West region arrived, they would be strictly controlled. But what could they do? They could not retreat. They did not even know how Lu Shu had accurately tracked their movements. They did not know that an unassuming spy like Xiao Mingzi had played a big role in this. Who was Xiao Mingzi to them? He was simply the boss of a gambling den. He was like an ant to them. But no one would have expected Xiao Mingzi to play such a significant role behind the scenes, to the point that he was able to counter the wealthy families. There was only one boss of a gambling den who was this brave in the palace. Furthermore, he had encountered Lu Shu. How did this make sense? But there was a certainty in what seemed to be a coincidence. If Xiao Mingzi was not an ambitious and confident person, he would be like the other bosses and simply fulfill his responsibilities. He would not dare to use his private resources to help Lu Shu. Now, the masters of the wealthy families felt an unparalleled sense of fear. It was as if everything was in Lu Shu's hands. They did not dare to act rashly. Many people felt that when they faced danger, they would definitely not give in. But when the time came, they completely forgot what they had said. All they could think about was surviving. The Imperial Dragon soldiers followed Lu Shu. Strangely, while the Imperial Palace soldiers all had blazing cloud foals, Lu Shu walked in front. This was not impressive. Lu Shu thought about it and took out a blazing cloud foals from the celestial map. But before he could ride it, the blazing cloud foal dodged and spoke. "Don't touch me." Lu Shu said, "Oh, so it's you." With that, Lu Shu shoved Lu Kongming back into the celestial map. He finally remembered that there was a blazing cloud foal whose body had been stolen. Zhang Weiyu and the rest were obedient. When they saw this awkward situation, they immediately got down from their horses and walked with Lu Shu. This way, no one in the vast palace dared to look at them. The civilians and aristocrats could only hear the heavy footsteps of the horses. They realized that the Imperial Dragon soldiers were heading towards the palace of the King of Gods. Some people could not help but wonder. There was a rumor in the palace that the palace of the King of Gods had been empty for many years. But the imperial edict caused everyone to be unsure of the truth. Now, Lu Shu and the others were heading towards the palace of the King of Gods. Everyone predicted that a great war would break out. Or would they prove that there was actually no one in the palace of the King of Gods? Li Haitan and the others, who were behind Zhang Weiyu and the rest, carried stacks of books. Every time they saw a house, they threw a book near the door. The civilians heard the sound of books hitting the ground. After the Imperial Dragon soldiers walked past, they could not help but open their doors and take the book. They quietly observed the book. Their expressions were the same as the king's studies scholars. Why did they give out these books on such an important occasion? But there was no time to think about this now. They were shocked by the contents of the book. The educated image of the old King of Gods that they had believed in for so many years immediately started to crumble. When Lu Shu felt a surge of distress points, he finally heaved a sigh of relief. It was difficult to earn the remaining distress points. The Imperial Dragon soldiers seemed to be patrolling their territory. They walked from the Peach Blossom Association to the Palace of the King of Gods. They were splendid. The previous time, they hurriedly came and hurriedly left. It was as if they were in a difficult situation. But this time, Lu Shu longed for someone to suddenly appear and try to kill him. This way, he might be able to find more clues. It was a pity that no one even dared to breathe until they reached the Palace of the King of Gods. Lu Shu stood outside the Palace of the King of Gods and silently laughed. Then, he pushed open the doors of the palace. The massive gate had not been opened for a very long time. When Lu Shu opened the door, the creaking sound produced by the door could be heard from kilometers away. Those who had been waiting for this moment felt as if their hearts had been held by someone. Then, their hearts were released. The doors of the Palace of the King of Gods had finally been opened. There were times when people walked past the palace. The handle of the red door had even started to rust, but there was no movement inside. The massive palace of the King of Gods was like a giant isolated island. No one dared to get close, but no one knew what happened inside either. Lu Shu walked in. Some civilians could not help but walk out of their homes. They realized that the Imperial Dragon soldiers did not kill the innocent. Thus, they slowly got closer, wanting to take a closer look. Some people would feel that they were far too daring after the situation was over. But at this moment, it was as if curiosity triumphed above all. They looked into the distance and saw the young man standing in front of the Imperial Dragon soldiers, like stars surrounding the moon. The young man looked at the empty palace of the King of Gods. The open door was like a void of determination. To the civilians in the palace, the young man standing in front of the palace of the King of Gods suddenly seemed familiar. It was as if he had finally returned. This place had not changed at all. Lu Shu walked inside. His steps were steady. He stood tall and straight. When Zhang Weiyu and the others saw this, they had complex feelings. Back then, when they were at King Lu Mountain, they would never have expected that they would one day follow this young man to rule the world.
What does it mean to be happy? 'Cause it looks like we all don't know. Glass half full or empty, man, we just putting on a show. Try to look to the heavens.